All right. Hello everyone. I think we should start. So we're not wasting any time. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Olga Makarova. I'm a research specialist at the Slavic Reference Service, which is a part of International Area Studies Library at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. We started this series, Meet the National Libraries, a couple of years ago. And had several goals in mind. We wanted to let the national libraries introduce their collections and services to patrons outside their home countries. We also wanted to have a platform for librarians to come together to meet their fellow librarians around the world, and also to stay on top of trends in the international librarianship. And also we wanted to give an opportunity for scholars and researchers to meet with the specialists and learn about collections, maybe before planning a research trip to that specific national library. I do have a spoiler alert. In January, we're hosting a webinar that will be featuring National Library of Serbia. But today, I'm very grateful for Dr. Ekaterina Gachevskaya for all her hard work behind the scenes, putting together and bringing everyone together. And so we're joined today by Curator of Turkish and Turkic collections, Michael Erdman, Curator of Germanic collections, Pardaad Chamsaz, Curator of Romance collections, Sophie de France, Curator of Slavonic and East European collections, Katie McElvanney, Curator of Oceania and Western languages in Asia collections, Lucy Rowland, and Curator of Philadelphia collections, Richard Morrell. And we will be learning about National Libraries Conference in 2021, engaging with users through talk videos, Google Book projects, Turkic collections, and the links to the Soviet collections, and I'm sure much more. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us. We will have time at the end for Q&A. You can type your questions in the chat or save them for later. And Pardaad and Lucy, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Hello, everybody. My colleague is going to load up the slides. So
that'd be me, would it?
That's right.
Right. Okay. I'd love to. Hold on. You happy, Lucy? I can see that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, hello, everybody. Welcome to our talk on a project that we did in 2021, a conference called National Libraries Now. So next slide. But first up, so who are we? Why did we organise a conference? So this is my colleague, Pardaad Chamsaz. He's the curator for Germanic collections, and I am Lucy Rowland, and I look after Oceania and Western language Asian collections. So we're curators at national libraries, and one of the sort of reasons we were interested in organising this conference was for us to learn more about what it was like to be curators at other national libraries around the world.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Pardaad. I guess the other thing to mention here is that obviously as individual curators for quite select areas, we also have responsibilities for, doing wider cross collections work, this being one of them. So we do tend to represent broader institutional projects as well. And also the British Library, I'm sure, like other national libraries, will consider themselves, I guess, global leaders, and would sort of seek to inaugurate new projects, new global collaborations, coordinate international work, as this conference seeks sort to do. And I guess the one last thing at this point to mention would be just the ability to for a bit of introspection, a bit of self-critique, using a conference like this to think about having taking a step back and understanding what the role is, and doing that through interrogating it in conversation with colleagues across the world.
Brilliant. Next slide would be great. Thank you. Okay, so how did we sort of conceive the conference? First thing we did was applied for a grant. So from the Conference of European National Librarians, so CENL, we applied for the Erland Colding Nielsen grant, which is for projects promoting international collaboration. And we were awarded €5,000 to fund the conference. So for us, we felt like there was a gap in the market for conferences for people working at collection levels rather than people who were working, we found that there was quite a lot for people working at much higher levels, but for people sort of working directly with collections, we felt that this could sort of fill a gap in the market. And we really wanted to make sure that it was exploring issues relevant to National Library curation now. We wanted it to be multinational and we wanted it to be inclusive. So we started off with those three aims and the sort of funding grant. And we teamed up with colleagues from international national libraries because we wanted it to be an international conference. So we teamed up with colleagues at the National Library of Jamaica and KBR, the National Library of Belgium. And this was really, really important, and it had a lot of benefits in terms of there was a lot of language issues that we hadn't really considered when we were sort of putting together the conference. Issues to do with time zones, trying to work out, when the best times would be to cover basically, people all around the world. How internet connectivity might be different in different regions, and it also really helped in promoting the conference to different regions as well, because people had, their own sort of networks as well. So there ended up being 6 of us all together. So 3 from the British Library plus a PhD placement student and 2 colleagues from other libraries. Next slide, please.
Bear with me, Lucy. I am trying to do that.
It's all right.
Ah, yeah, here we go.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. So in terms of the format of the conference, when we applied from the grant, originally we had planned it to be an in-person conference, a physical conference actually. But obviously this, the COVID pandemic happened, and we moved the conference online, which actually turned out to be much better in terms of inclusion. In that way, we were able to, people could attend for free from all around the world. So we set up a website. We asked for people to send in video presentations, which we set up on the website to view. And then for the conference itself, we featured Q&A panels based around the presentations. So we also had intervention speakers, which was our alternative to keynote speakers. So these were people who might be from slightly outside the library world, but they would sort of give provocative responses really to our question of what is a national library or what it could be. And we also had social events as well. That picture is actually of one of the social events. Pardaad, your hair is a lot longer in that one. So we had 60 video presentations, 19 panel discussions, intervention speakers, and we had more than 700 attendees from around the world who registered for the conference. So next slide again, please, Pardaad. Brilliant. Okay. And in terms of topics, we didn't really, set out to make that too prescriptive. We gave some ideas, but mostly the idea was we wanted to look at what people were doing now. So the topics sort of naturally arose from what people were doing, so recent and current projects that people have been working on at national libraries, as well as exploring some of the challenges people were facing in building and interpreting collections. So there's a list of them here. This is all the panel topics. I think they offer like a really interesting snapshot of what was happening in national libraries in 2021, what it meant to work in a national library. Obviously, there, you know, we ended up with 2 panels on the COVID pandemic because that was, you know, very pertinent at the time. Sustainability, which has now become much more of a topical issue in libraries, digitization, but also working with other libraries and how people were doing that and collaborating with communities, and looking at sort of more themes like decolonization, what people were doing in their libraries. And so there was some really interesting presentations there. Okay, Pardaad, that's you, I think, next one.
You notice how the slides change quicker when I'm about to speak. Okay, so I was going to talk a little bit about the aims and how we assess the impact, I guess, post-conference. So there's a couple of graphics here. I guess the caveat is that the sample of responses to our feedback form is probably quite small. But these questions won't be affected by that. So this one shows obviously the locations of the panelists by IFTA region. So you can get a sense that obviously Europe still dominates, but we did have a representation from every continent, which we were proud of, but there could obviously be more in potential future conferences. And then on the right, you have the locations of the attendees, which again show a bit more of a broader distribution. And yes, so the aim here, we've put the emphasis on connecting with colleagues worldwide. So the sort of mechanisms behind reaching out, we used IFLA mailing lists, social media channels, which had varying success, has to be said. I think we'd have to think about how to do that a bit more organically next time, creating connections a lot earlier. I guess the point of the international part of this conference, which Lucy's already touched on, on one level, it was to do with just sharing our approaches and understanding how completely different contexts facilitate completely different working practices and how those can sort of stretch our own understandings of our roles. And as national libraries, our remits are quite broad. They touch on things like how to be a civic organization, how to act in your local area as well. And I think other organizations potentially do that quite differently and potentially better than the British Library. So there was a lot to share, a lot to learn, a lot to challenge our existing practices by making it international, by trying to understand those vastly different contexts. And you could see that in Lucy's list of topics, actually, that there's a whole panel on how to pivot in the pandemic as well, which talked a lot about job creation, which is not something that we focus on. We haven't got the remit to do something like that. So, yeah. And so I guess the last thing to say on this slide would be, to try and get away from a European mindset. Whether we've really done that, I think that it's probably debatable. It's not debatable. We didn't do that, but the idea was to kind of to get away from that European mindset, as we say. More work to be done in that regard. However, okay, this is the same aim, but just with the emphasis somewhere else, on working with the collections rather than sort of strategic and corporate aspects of national libraries. Lucy's already suggested that the whole idea was driven by talking with colleagues who are library people, practitioners working with collections. Here we have the breakdowns. As you can see, a very small percentage of those panelists were, self-described as executive. The majority coming from collections areas. And again, similar situation in terms of attendees. So yeah, Lucy already mentioned that you do tend to see at conferences like this spokespeople for the National Libraries being of a slightly less hands-on level. So that was part of the aim. I suppose one question, maybe something we can touch on later, would be, where IFLA fits in. And, we did make use of their mailing lists and some of the information that's already out there. That's a long-running organization, set of working groups that potentially feel like, work very well, but we felt that this was doing something slightly different. Again, we could touch on that later. And yes, I think, then this kind of ethos made for a very sort of level and collegiate and sort of practical atmosphere, without too much promotional activity, I suppose, in the run-up or in the event. Okay. Yes. And then the second aim we want to set on the line, covering kind of a lot of what we've already said, but yes, so to learn about new projects, reflect on current challenges, and foster collaboration. You've got a couple of pictures here from our intervention speakers that Lucy's already mentioned. Alberto Mangel on the right and Kairani Baraka. So, I'm wondering what I wanted to say on here. Yeah, I suppose, just to think about the interventions, the idea was to basically take a step back. The whole conference, in a way, was that kind of creating a space for people who are maybe concerned with quite specialized areas to think a bit broadly about different work going on in different contexts and different areas. Even, collections people might not know or be involved in work to do with conservation, community engagement, marketing, all the kind of stuff that did come through. And this was a way of allowing ourselves to engage with all those issues. As you can see, the stats kind of bear that out. The sort of diversity of ideas was very much appreciated. And I guess the last stats there, it was a platform for people to present their work, potentially sort of highlighting the fact that maybe people don't get the chance necessarily internally to showcase some of the stuff they're doing, and it may make more sense on a collaborative scale to share with people doing similar things elsewhere. And I think we can probably move on to our final slide, Lucy.
That's true. I'm just thinking about what you said there in terms of people being able the opportunity to present. And one of the things that we did try was, having lots of different options for people to be able to contribute. So if they didn't feel like they wanted to present, we gave people the option to do a blog post maybe instead of that, or and pre-recording a video without having to be on a panel. We tried to think of different ways to encourage people who might not necessarily present at conferences to kind of take part. But I definitely think in terms of, the challenges, just by as much as we tried to consider sort of language, we're still primarily an English-speaking committee. We put out our information in English with some translations where we could, but that's definitely something that would hinder us being able to reach a truly sort of global audience. And time zones, again, it was amazing that people were, someone in New Zealand was speaking at the same time as someone in Argentina, for example, which were, I think, the two polar opposites that we found with time zones. But everyone was very good at staying up late or getting up early. But yeah, for me, I think that was two quite big challenges that stopped us from reaching further, I think.
Yeah, I think the questions that remain for me would be, I guess, how genuinely did we fulfill those aims, really? How genuinely global was it? Could we have reached out more? I think another thing that we've discussed at length is the legacy of this conference. Where does it go from here? There was potential for to make it annual or a biannual thing. Hasn't come to fruition yet, but I don't know, maybe the question of why the legacy hasn't continued it might say something about the form of the conference itself. You know, what we touched on earlier around it being a platform for people to present. Did it do more than that? I mean, was it genuinely collaborative? Did people genuinely change their practice based on what they heard was going on the other side of the world? Or was it just more, you know, informative and interesting, but potentially not transformative? Not saying that every conference should be transformative, but it's just something to bear in mind, I guess. I guess one last thing to mention would be just the politics that comes through the organisation of an international event. I guess on one hand, I mean, we were funded by Senel, but I guess because of the majority of the organisation happened at the British Library, there was that reputational aspect and representational aspect to take into account. What kind of ideas were we forwarding through the programme, and you know, to what extent did we have to sort of run that by various people at the library, and the potential political consequences of creating a programme that might bring together vastly divergent attitudes. And this did come to a head on a couple of occasions, where unfortunately, you know, the speakers felt they weren't able to participate due to the presence of other ideas that would already made the programme. So there was a lot of things to negotiate in the background, and I guess it was a reminder of the political nature of national libraries. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say, Lucy. I don't know.
No, I think that's the same, and I think maybe we went in with the naivety of what we thought counts as a national library. What is national? You know, we had to end up asking ourselves these questions all the way through. So that was another thing we learnt. But yeah, that's the end of our presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right, thank you very much. Thanks for sharing all this insights. They're very, very interesting, and I hope we can discuss them a little bit more at the end. And now I think we have Katie.
Thanks, Olga. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see that fine. So as Olga said, I'm a curator of East European collections at the British Library, specifically Ukrainian and Belarusian collections. But I also manage the curatorial checks for the library's Google Books project. And this is what I'm going to be speaking to you a little bit about today. And this is where the slides don't move. There we go. So the British Library is just one of a number of major libraries around the world that has partnered with Google to digitize part of its collections. And the library's involvement, partnership with Google Books has been running since 2011. And it includes out of copyright books from the 16th to the 19th centuries. And to date, over 600,000 volumes have been digitized, which is a huge achievement. And this includes material in over 180 different languages, including a number of minority languages, and a vast range of subjects from early travel writing, literature in minority languages, to printed music and the invention of mechanical engines. And it's a big project that involves colleagues from a number of teams across the library, including operations, curatorial, conservation, digital scholarship, technology, and many more. And a number of colleagues actually presenting today are involved in the curatorial side of things for the project. So they help to check items are in scope, so within the copyright range, in a fit state to be digitized, and also identifying items of interest for future research and collections or promotion activities. So something that might work well in a blog, or and it could be useful in another format or for other research possibilities. And one of the advantages of the project is that it enables mass digitization rather than focusing entirely on well-known items, so specific authors or eras or themes. And this allows us to provide free online access to collections that might not otherwise be well-known or easily discovered. And it facilitates new and unique research opportunities and gives access to broader diversity of voices, authors, and items across a number of curatorial areas. And in addition to the usefulness of the texts themselves, crucial aspects, evidence and details of book history can be examined online, such as annotations, marks of past ownership, so inscriptions, bookplates, stamps, and bindings, the use of illustrations, diagrams, and details of historical printing practices and typography. So you can see a huge range of uses of this material. And all of the volumes are available for individual view and download for personal study or education-related non-commercial purposes from the British Library catalogue via the library's IIIF standard-enabled universal viewer, and also from Google Books website. And I'll show you some examples of how those platforms look in just a moment. So I thought it would be interesting to show you some of the most viewed British Library items as part of this project. And we have the data from the last 6 months. So here you can see 3 items that in terms of number of users over the last 6 months, that are in the top 5 sort of most viewed books. So at number 1, we have Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This is a 1867 edition. And the next one you can see is the Treasury of All Logarithms, published in 1794 in Leipzig. And this was the major work of Uriel Georg Vega, a Slovene mathematician, physicist. And just to give you an example of some of the figures, so Great Expectations has had in the last 6 months over 47,000 full book views. And Vega's work has had about 27,000 views. And curiously here on the right, you see a work titled The Names and Descriptions of the Proprietors of Unclaimed Dividends on Bank Stock and on All Government Funds and Securities Transferable at the Bank of England. So I thought that was quite a curious one as well. And this was published in 1823, and it's had over 21,000 views in the last 6 months. So very popular. And here are 2 books as well. So you can also look at number of page views. So these are the kind of 2 of the most popular books by page views, slightly different. And here we have Frankenstein, 1818 edition, and a translation of Romeo and Juliet into Russian. It was published in 1861 in Moscow. And I think it's worth noting here the popularity of Frankenstein and Great Expectations as sort of 2 of the most viewed books is surely directly linked to the English literature syllabus in UK schools. And you see certain spikes throughout the year around sort of revision times and things and exams. So just to give you, this is also some statistics relating to language of volumes viewed over the last 6 months. So English is the most popular. Then we have German, French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, and then other languages. You can see here as well. Just to point out though that this relies on kind of language codes being used in catalogue records. So, you know, it only gives us a snapshot really, given the sort of the age of some of these books, but records are constantly being updated with language codes. So there's lots of work being done, and I'll show you a little bit later about how you can search the corpus by language. And we have a lot of minority languages that you can search by those language codes in the catalogue. Here we have a couple of other examples of digitized items. So we've got an image from an early booklet about photography issued in 1863. This is titled Photographic Wrinkles, Remedies and Recipes, published in London. And on the right here, you can see the title page and portrait of Frederick Douglass, renowned American abolitionist, public speaker, human rights advocate. And this is from the first edition of his narrative of the life of FD, an American slave, which was published in Boston in 1854. So these are all available via our catalogue, and I'll show you how to search for them shortly. And as we are presenting at the Slavic Reference Service today, I wanted to show you a couple of items from our East European collections that have been digitized as part of the project. So here we have a translation into Ukrainian, and this is published in Vienna in 1871. So despite attempts to translate the Bible into standard Ukrainian in the 19th century, the Russian Orthodox Church opposed the printing of the Bible in Ukrainian. So as such, a number of translations appeared outside of the Russian Empire. And among them was this translation of the Gospel of Matthew by the Ukrainian poet, writer, historian, translator Panteleimon Kulish and Ivan Kuli, which was published in Vienna. Oops. And show you an example of an item in minority language. This is a primer in Kashubian, which is a minority language in Poland, and it was published in 1850. So you see we have a huge range of items in different languages, different subjects that have been digitized as part of this project. So how do you find these items? So it's quite simple. You go to our catalogue, the address is here, explore.bl.uk, and you can either search using the term BL Google Books, all one word, and this will bring up everything that has been digitized as part of the project and that's currently available. There'll be items that have been digitized but that aren't yet available in our catalogue. But you can also put in a search term. So here, just for example, the search term clocks, and it would bring up books that that link to the search term. But you can also search and filter by language, and there are another number of other options for filtering as well. So I suggest, yeah, if you go on our catalogue and have a sort of play around with that, if you have more specific questions relating to the project or specifically to, say, Slavonic East European collections that have been digitized, please feel free to drop me an email or ask questions after the presentations. And you can find my email there. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have next Michael.
I'll have to turn on my microphone. Yes, thank you very much. So I'm just going to share my screen. And we'll start with the presentation. So thank you very much to everyone for being here. It's my great pleasure to talk to you today about the Turkic periodicals at the British Library. My name is Dr. Michael Erdman, and I'm the curator of the Turkish and Turkic collections. And today I'm going to spend a bit of time looking at some of the materials that we have in Turkic languages and how they, well, particularly some of the periodicals that we have in Turkic languages and how they might relate to histories of the Soviet Union, the Soviet space, and particularly exile or oppositional politics over the 20th century. So perhaps I have to do this. There we go. And so I'm going to do this by starting out with looking at what the Turkish and Turkic collections are, and look at some of our pre and early Soviet magazines, and then go on to our post-1945 periodicals. And I'll end with a few different looks at a few different materials that we hold in our collections and that relate to groups outside of the Soviet Union during the 20th century, how you might find them and how they might relate to other sort of Soviet history materials. And hopefully I'll do this with interesting photographs throughout the presentation, as you see here, such as this Turkmen magazine from the 1930s. So I had at first thought that there'd be a bit of an introduction as to what the library holds, but I'll try to give you a bit of a sense of where we are within the broader context. So there are about 35,000 printed items in Turkic languages at the British Library. That's 35,000 out of about 170 to 200 million items. We are, of course, the National Library of the United Kingdom, and therefore the one legal deposit library that by law must receive a copy of anything published in the UK. So the Turkish and Turkic periodicals or collections as a whole really do reflect a very small portion of the British Library's holdings. Of these 35,000 printed items, and those are sort of bibliographic records, so we might have a few more individual volumes, but within those about 300 records relate to serials in about 20 languages. So as you might have guessed with the name of the section, these are all of the periodicals in languages from the Turkic language family. So the vast majority are in Turkish, Republican Turkish, or Ottoman Turkish, but we also cover a wide variety of different languages, including Kazakh, Uzbek, Tatar, and smaller minority languages like Shor, Sakha, Nogai, Kumyk, Kabardino-Balkar. So anything that you can throw under or within the kitchen sink of Turkic languages will be found here. And these periodicals do represent the history of publishing, of periodical publishing in the Turkic world. So we go from the first Necma Havadis, the first Armeno-Turkish periodical produced in the Ottoman Empire, through the birth of publishing, periodical publishing in the Russian Empire. So a few things from the 1870s and 1880s, going through to post-constitutional revolutions, and really the 20th century is our richest collection of periodicals. And that's why I'm going to be fairly quick when I go through our pre and early Soviet magazines. And so for those of you who might be aware, the first Turkic magazines that were produced in the Russian Empire were in the late 1870s in Tbilisi, in what would later be known as Azerbaijani. But the most famous is Erdman, which comes from Crimea, produced by Ismail Gasprinsky. It is unfortunately not one of the physical items we hold. We hold about 5 items from the pre-November Revolutionary period in Turkic languages. We have microfiche of Erdman, but we also hold a number of other items from, especially from the post-1905 period, when relaxation of restraints on publishing and freedom of expression were introduced. And so we have, for example, a copy of Ayina, which is a publication from Samarkand. We have a decent but incomplete run of magazines from Orenburg known as Shura, produced by the Fakhreddin sort of dynasty, Rizaeddin Fakhreddin, a very important part of understanding the development of Russian, official Russian Islamic hierarchies prior to 1917. And we've got a few other periodicals from Baku as well, attesting to the development of Turkic and Russian bilingual publications for workers. These are sort of put into context by the much broader post-1917 collections, where we have 2 examples of non-Soviet post-1917 works. So one from the Democratic Republic of Azerbaijan, and another Yeşil Ada from Crimea under Kolchak's regime. But for the most part, something that's quite dear to my heart are the 20-odd periodicals, such as those that you can see here, which relate to the 1920s and early 1930s. These are works that are were sponsored by Soviet authorities, or at least given approval, and whether Crimea or Azerbaijan, Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Bashkiria, or Tatarstan, we have examples of these within our collections, and they really do speak to the development of local language propaganda, local language intellectual foments, of intellectual spheres of discussion about Soviet policies and Soviet changes. And they also really help to highlight some of the interaction between local and indigenous intellectuals and Bolsheviks with authorities in Leningrad, in Moscow, in Kazan, in other major centers. These items are cataloged on our Explore online catalog, but I do have an in-depth catalog of the articles produced in 2019 by a Chevening Fellow, Dr. Akmal Bazarbayev, who provided us with not only the names of authors and titles, but also the subjects. And so if you do not read a Turkic language, or like most people who read a Turkic language cannot read the old script, and fear not, we do have a way for you to investigate what magazines we might have that might be of interest, depending on the topic that you're covering, and a way for you to be able to see them easily. The pre-1930, pre-Great Terror period is one that is quite self-contained, and it's quite a small component of our collections, which are far greater when it comes to post-1945. Here, like many other national libraries around the world and many research institutions in the United States, we collected the major literary, cultural, and scientific outputs, especially from the national and subnational libraries in the Soviet Union through a system of exchanges. So chances are most of these periodicals are similar to ones you might find in Illinois, in Urbana, in Bloomington, in Columbia, at the Library of Congress. But we do have good runs, and if there are periodicals that are missing or issues that are missing, chances are we have them. And so these are sort of your standard block of periodicals. Something that we also hold that might not perhaps be represented at other national libraries around the world are single and incomplete runs of minority language and smaller press publications. So you have here two, for example, Shiohluk, a Kabardino Balkar literary magazine starting in about 1960 or maybe 1959, continuing up to the present. You also have Tang, a Nogai literary magazine. And these give a good idea, although we don't have complete runs, they give a good idea to anyone who's trying to study not only literary history in languages like Nogai and Kabardino-Balkar, but also about the sort of ecosystem of publishing, the ecosystem of libraries and authors, and state support for minority languages and minority nationalities. Many of these continued on, and you can still find some of the people who contributed to them, but they're not easily discoverable at many institutions around the world. And I've tried to make sure that these can then be at least discovered, their metadata, through WorldCat, so that we can then begin to piece together more complete runs across libraries. Speaking of sort of lesser known works, and works that perhaps might be something that scholars have not entirely thought about employing in the history of Turkic peoples and the periodical press with respect to the Soviet Union, the last component of our collections I'd like to highlight are our exile periodicals. And these can be divided into two groups. The first are those from the interwar period, pre-1945, and these are sourced from Berlin, Mukden, which is in Manchuria, present-day PRC, Paris, Tokyo, and Warsaw. These are works such as Chades, Shimali Kafkasyaso, and Gorny Kafkaskalon. Sorry, I'm mixing the two now, but Mountaineers of the Caucasus, Hurriyet Yolu, usually bilingual Russian, Turkish, or Russian Chagatai magazines that speak to sort of the first wave of exiles. I'm quite excited that Lukasz Wałka is here, because I know that the Czech National Library has just released a new work about these sorts of periodicals from the broader Russian community, and also looked at some of these sort of minority language periodicals. And so we also hold some that I hope can gradually be sewn together with a worldwide understanding of how these periodicals functioned across different cities in Europe and Asia. And the second group, which you see on the screen, are sort of top-line holdings of diasporic and exile magazines and periodicals from Turkey. So these are people who perhaps are second or third generation exiles, or in the case of Caucasian peoples like the Circassians and Adige, and members of the post-1864 diaspora who are established in Turkey and whose works we've collected. So on the left-hand side, for example, Hazır, an exile magazine related to Azerbaijan. On the right-hand side, Kafkaska Derneği, Kafkaska Kültürel Dergi. These are works that really speak to the communities that are longstanding in Turkey, and that have longstanding relationships with organizations and official bodies in Russia and the Caucasus, but that have gone through various different levels of political activism. And so if you're interested in Caucasian history, and particularly 20th century, 21st century politics, I'd invite you to consider taking a look at these and getting in touch about what we hold and how that might relate to whatever research project you or your readers have. So with this, I'll say thank you for your attention, and just to remind you that you can reach me by email, through our Asian and African Studies blog, sister blog to the European and American Studies, or through Twitter at Altay2Uyghur. And I look forward to your questions and comments in the section at the end of the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Erdman. It was very insightful for those who are working with these languages and with these materials. And I think we have one more speaker, Sophie.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I'll try to share my screen. Okay, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm Sophie de France, I'm curator for the Romance collections at the British Library. So the Romance collection is a kind of umbrella term that include materials in French, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, Catalan, Occitan, and also in non-Romance languages such as Basque and Breton. But we are actually, we have curators for specialized in languages. So I'm specialized in French. We have a curator specialized in Italian and another one working with the Hispanic languages. And we have a lead curator who is also a French specialist. The French collections are quite big at the British Library. They are said to be around 1 million items, which is apparently the second biggest collection of French items after the French National Library. So it's really a very big collection. So we are acquiring contemporary material, but we are also, although officially we are dealing with printed post-1850 material, we are actually also acquiring antiquarian books and older books and second-hand books. And these have a separate budget from the contemporary collections. And we are trying, recently we are trying to work more closely with our development office and with fundraising office so that we can diversify our budget maybe and also try and acquire items that maybe were not traditionally acquired in the past, like illustrated items or items for children, you know, from children literature or books that are more maybe materially objects than books. So we are working on that. And recently we've received a donation from a trust called the Mind Charitable Trust, which has allowed us to acquire a lot of early 19th century items, which are very visual. So the donor was quite interested in having illustrated books that are visual, that show the evolution of images and illustration and pictures in the late 18th, early 19th century. So we've acquired quite a few books, and one of the questions we had was how we could best promote these books, because that was something that was important for the donor, and they wanted these collections to be known and you know, to not to be secret in a way or hidden. And so one of the things we've decided was because the British Library was actually in May 2022, the British Library had started its TikTok channel, which was new to the library. We've decided that we could try and showcase these items, or at least one of these items on the TikTok channel. So we've decided to show something that was actually quite complicated, because it's a panorama. So it's a very, very long band of paper, which is rolled around a metal kind of pole. It's 4 meters long, so it's actually quite difficult to manipulate. And it's actually a good item to film, because that's not something that people are going to see very casually. You know, it's going to be complicated to actually show it. So we've tried to do a video with it. We had to think about it, because how do you show something that is so long and so unusual in a way? So we've decided to just roll it, unroll it, and then play maybe with the speed and play with the rhythm. So I'm going to try and show you the video. I hope it works. I don't know if the sound is on. I hope not, because I hate hearing myself. So I'm speaking all over the video. It's a bit less than 2 minutes. So we are going to try and see if it works.
Plan that the first section pasted together and rolled around the metal roller. It's a chromolithograph, so it's printed in color. In effect, it is a long cartoon describing the life of new recruits in the early years of the 20th century and in the years leading to the First World War. We don't have a precise date for it. The artist, called Francis Poulbeau, was born in 1879, and he had been working as a newspaper at the age of 16. By the early 20th century, he was well known as an affichist. The printer here, Eugène Verneau, was associated with printing the works of Toulouse-Lautrec. The scenes depict the arrival of raw recruits before being kitted out. They describe the barracks, the duty drill, the sick parade, the guardroom, the field service, and the soldiers out on a Sunday pass. Poulbeau himself had been a recruit in 1899, so his description was somehow based on real life. Poulbeau became a caricaturist famous for his portraits of children, and the word Poulbeau is actually used in France to describe a street urchin nowadays. And he was famous for his propaganda work during the First World War. What's really strange about this item is that we don't really know where and how it was used. It's still a mystery. There's not much research about it, but we'd love to know and discover more.
Okay, that's it. So yeah, so that was our video. So the idea was that because we actually didn't know much about the provenance of the item, or why or how it was used, we decided to try and ask the question on TikTok. But then we realized that maybe TikTok is not really Twitter, so it doesn't really work the same way, right? So you don't really have academics exchanging ideas or suggestions of things. So it's really more to show something which is visually striking, but it's not really the place to have an academic discussion. So, well, that was, we tried. We didn't get any answer to our question really, but it was good to make us think about, the difference between TikTok and a blog and Twitter, or the place formerly known as Twitter, or I don't know. So where people can discuss more. One of the things that I've realized is that we have a departmental Twitter and we have a departmental blog, and we can be quite reactive with that. We can easily put up a blog very quickly if we need to, and Twitter is even easier if we want to comment or or even delete tweet. But this is the institutional channel. It's much heavier, and of course preparing a video takes quite a long time. You need to find the space, you need to find a room that's suitable for light and sound. You need to work with a videographer, you need to book the videographer. So it's actually something that needs a lot of work. And from the people from the social media team who are organizing this, they also need, for them it's also complicated because they do need to have a lot of material in advance so that they can post regularly without interruptions and with a kind of program. So it's an interesting place to post visual items and to make your collections known, but it demands a lot more work in the background, of course. And I just wanted to post to show. So that's an interesting example, because these are 3 children panoramas that we've acquired recently, and actually that was thanks to Katya, because they were offered for sale by a bookseller who specialized in Eastern European and Central European material, and actually they were published in France in the 30s, but they have been illustrated by a Ukrainian woman called Alexandra Exter, who immigrated to France in 1924, I think, and she had a workshop, she had a salon even in Kiev, but then she immigrated to Paris. She was linked to the avant-garde and to to surrealist artists, but she also worked a lot for theater, and she illustrated quite a few, not that many, but some children's books, which are very beautiful and are also in the form of panoramas. So thanks to Katja alerting us to that, we've acquired them, and so we've prepared videos to put on TikTok. They are not quite ready yet. There is a lot of work to do because once more we try to unfold them and show how you could fold them. So it's still, we still need to work on it. But I just thought that was a nice example to see how we can work together and acquire material that's relevant to all of us in our department. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you to each presenter for very informative talks. We do have time for questions, so you can either raise your hand or put in the chat. Okay, while we're waiting, I guess I can jump in some of the questions. My first question is to, I guess, Lucy and Pardaad, and regarding the conference that you were organizing. And you mentioned that you were thinking about its legacy and, you know, future. And I was just thinking, and you mentioned that originally you planned it to be in person. So I was just wondering, what do you think if it's going to be in person, or if it was in person, do you think it might allow for more meaningful connections, and then it might be a venue to be you know, explored and happen more regularly? Or I don't know, maybe if there are any other things that you might share that can you know, help it to be a regular event.
Yeah, I mean, I think an in-person conference is quite a different thing, particularly, you know, particularly now, I think coming out of, you know, attending so many online events, I think there's something unique in an in-person event. And I wonder, I mean, the idea was that we would be able to pass it on to another sort of group, and that way that would be more helpful in sort of being able to make it more global. So if it was held in a different time zone or a different region or even different languages, but yeah, work's kind of got in the way quite a lot of that. But I mean, yeah, I don't think that's the end of it, but I think it would be up to the next sort of person to decide what would be best.
In a way, because it was the first time it happened, and while we had aims.
Can't quite hear you, Pardaad, sorry.
That's because I don't have a microphone now. I was, yeah, just suggesting that because it was the first time we ran this. It was only really, you know, in the aftermath that we kind of worked out what it actually was. I mean, it was just quite a unique thing that, you know, we didn't have experience running before. So I think the legacy issue would never have been able to be worked out in advance or sketched out or anything. So it's good that we're thinking about it now. I think one thing to also mention is that we tried a few different platforms to create collaboration during the conference, one of those being Slack, to create a space for those who maybe, well, for two reasons. One, to sort of make it easier for people to communicate during presentations, conversations, rather than being sort of, you know, on the spot and named and visible on the chat during the talks, but also to sort of generate conversation before panels and after panels. So each panel had a separate Slack space basically, and questions were coming in before, during, and after. And the idea and there was a few general spaces on the Slack channel. The idea being that Slack workspace itself could be a part of the legacy, which kind of held up a little bit, but you know, doesn't necessarily exist in the same way now. So we played around with it a bit, but yeah.
Yeah, I think in terms of technology, it was such a steep learning curve for us to suddenly try and do something online. You know, we learned how to set up a website, how to, you know, do subtitle YouTube videos, the Slack channel. There was a lot of sort of technology going on, and I think yeah, it's kind of harder to maintain that in the long term than maybe a physical conference is quite maybe more of a finite event. So I can see that might work a bit better, but yeah, I don't know. A hybrid would obviously be the best thing, but.
Well, I hope it become possible in the future. I think it's a great idea. It would be sad not to continue with it, probably. I guess I have another question to Katie. Oh, okay. I'll go Taylor first. Taylor, if you can unmute yourself and go ahead with your question.
Wonderful. Excuse me. Thank you, everybody, for the really wonderful session. I just have a brief question for Dr. Erdman. I know that this is a little outside the bounds of your presentation, but could you speak a little bit about the Republican Turkish sources you have, particularly periodicals? I'd be interested if you could just give a brief overview. Thank you.
Sure. So, as with most libraries, Republican Turkish, we start from about 1928, and there, I mean, if you're looking at sort of 1923, meaning the Republic with you know, but in Arabic script, we have quite a good number of literary magazines as well as sort of current events. And for those, you can probably find those. I did a sort of guide to them for Hazine, which is a sort of an independent sort of NGO arts organization based on arts and culture of, and textual heritage, really, of West Asia. But we do have a good selection of those. And then going into the 1930s, it seems that whereas purchases from the Soviet Union were quite difficult for obvious reasons, those from Turkey were fairly easy. And so we've got a fairly comprehensive look at some of the major periodicals that were produced both by the government in Ankara and also by a number of different sort of opposition groups or sort of different strands of political thought. So we have, for example, Kadro and some of the, which I think is 30s, but probably going into the 40s, of sort of left-wing intellectuals. We have a number of the sort of Nazi-leaning or fascist-leaning periodicals of the 1930s as well. And then going through from the 50s onwards, we had sort of just a general purchase order for all of the major, so Istanbul University and Ankara University of Ankara, or, you know, the Middle East Technical University, and a number of different other universities in Ankara, their theology departments, their literary departments, their political science and economics departments. And we cover those very regularly. It's quite easy to purchase from Turkey. Unlike the Soviet Union, where a lot of those periodicals fell off in the 90s because of supply concerns, and for Turkey, we've continued on. And so if it's been published right up through the 90s up to today, we will have quite complete collections of those. One thing that I've been trying to do from sort of 2000 onwards, I've only been at the library about 6 years, but sort of back stock really. And we now have a very good collection of Turkish, of what they call in Turkey, Türkieli publications. So the other languages of Anatolia and smaller minority groups as well. And so you will find major publications from the universities and from large publishers through Explore, our online catalog. But you'll also find a very good range of Kurdish publications, and a number of sort of small run left-wing organizations and their publications from Turkey, and then the publications of Caucasian communities like the Laz and Circassians as well. and those are hit and miss for complete runs. But generally, I try to make sure that we have sort of that breadth of different publishing formats, publishing sort of, profit, non-profit publishing, small community, sort of city-based, regionally based, and countrywide publishing, so that you get a bit of a broad view. And I also work with a number of institutions in Turkey who are interested in periodical publishing. So if we don't have it, chances are I can probably help you to access someone in Turkey today who might be able to get you scans of something, or find a way in which you'd be able to access a small run periodical as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Mel?
Hi, thank you. Thank you everyone to the presenters. It's so interesting. I'm just up the road at Cambridge, but even though I've learned a lot today from your presentations, even from those I work closely with. And actually my question is for Katie, who I do work very closely with in Cambridge and in London. So the Google Books thing, it's so interesting to hear about it. Of course, I knew about it, but I hadn't actually realized about how to search in the catalogue. And my question is about the fact that, I then went and immediately did a search and started to narrow by language. And of course, and this is going to be something that is a problem for all of us in terms of metadata for older collections, things that were on card catalogues that were then transferred, particularly by non-specialists and so on, is I noticed there are nearly 20,000 entries for an unspecified linguistic content, which everyone will be familiar with. And I wondered, Katie, whether there's anything through the Google Books project that might help with that, whether by making these things available, there's any option for any kind of like crowdsourcing, or whether Google itself offers any help with that, because it must be a bit, quite a frustration for you and for other curators to know that that's the case, but the numbers are so high that you really do need help elsewhere. But yeah, but otherwise it's so exciting, and I'll certainly promote it in Cambridge.
Thanks, Mel. That's a really good question. Well, so one thing we've been doing internally, and it was a great sort of lockdown project, we did have a project to assign sort of language codes to items that were missing language codes, again, for historical reasons, or may have been assigned incorrect language codes. So we are sort of slowly addressing some of these issues, because it's obviously, the catalogue as a whole. In terms of whether Google offers specific help in these cases, not that I know of, but it's certainly something I will ask about, because yeah, it's obviously a huge issue, and it's not just items that don't have language codes, therefore can't be searched for by language, but it's also, as you will know from the areas you work with, Mel, items that have been assigned perhaps incorrect language code. So thinking specifically here of a Ukrainian item that's been assigned a Russian language code historically. So, those sorts of errors do exist. So we do have various projects to address kind of, more specific collections. But I will get back to you if I have any updates on sort of bigger project-wide initiatives.
Thank you so much.
Well, I also had a question for Katie about some of the internal considerations for what materials get prioritized for this project and for digitization.
So one of the great things about the project is that we don't sort of specifically select kind of collections of sort of specific collections, and that leads to this amazing diversity of materials. But obviously we do have considerations around they have to be out of copyright, so we have very specific date ranges, and the condition of the materials. Something has to be in a condition that it's not going to be damaged in the digitization process, those sorts of things. So yeah, we do have some kind of internal criteria, but they don't relate to sort of, we would like to digitize this whole specific collection, if that makes sense, which, you know, pros and cons. I think ultimately it's a really positive thing, and it means we've been able to digitize materials that just otherwise probably wouldn't have been prioritized for digitization. So yeah, I think it's a good thing.
I was just going to say, as someone who works with Katie on the curatorial side of the Google Books project, it's also, I mean, the British Library, in terms of like going through the collection, it's a very difficult thing to do. You know, it's basements and basements of books, so we don't often get the opportunity to sort of rifle through shelves, and the Google Books project does allow for that. So we do check them physically by hand, and you get to see amazing end papers and wonderful illustrations that you might not have thought to look at because the title's very boring or you don't know about. So something else that comes out of it is we do find books of interest, and we let people know. So we let people, the curator in charge of that sort of section, know that there's this really interesting book that we've sort of come across. So that's an added bonus of, I think, well, certainly for me working with it, is you actually get to, you know, rifle through some books in the basements.
Absolutely. And you get to work with people from different teams as well, which I think is really important. It's an example of one of our very collaborative projects at the library.
That's great. I also had a question for Michael about the format of the Turkic collections, and if it's print or microfilm. What would be the way to get about accessing those?
Certainly. So the vast majority of what we have is print, and some of the older materials. So we have, if you're looking for, say, late 19th century, early 20th century, some of those are actually microfilm, so as you know, Katie has gone on a bit about copyright and sort of the idea of the great thing about Google Books is everything is out of copyright, which means it's quite easy, whereas when it's possibly in copyright makes it a lot harder. So most of the material, because it's 20th century, means that it has to be accessed on site. And so you can come to our reading rooms and easily call them up. Depending on where the material is held, it has to be sometimes brought in from Yorkshire from our off-site storage, and it takes about 48 hours. There are some items that, so the copyright is becoming a bit more flexible in terms of understanding what copyright in different countries is. So there are certain, so for example, some of the exile periodicals, it's quite difficult to even get copies of, for example, microfiche, where we have them only as microfiche because our copyright will follow the rules in China, and in China that copyright structure is very strict, or in India it's very strict. And so often there are rare chances in which we are able to point you towards the imaging studio and to say, if you can't come to St. Pancras to make use of either the few microfiche items that we have, or the bulk of them being print, that we'll be able to provide you at cost at a certain cost with digital copies. But most times, it is about coming and physically using them. However, if you are interested in some of the earlier materials that we have, our colleagues particularly in Central Europe and also in Turkey, have been very keen to digitize things and with a looser interpretation of copyright. And so occasionally I do have some of the items that are of greater demand from our collections. I know exactly where I can route you through to access these. And it's a great benefit that the European Union still funds projects like Urbana, which make our jobs much easier, I think.
Thank you. All right. I don't see any other questions. I guess it's Monday, probably. But I once again would like to thank all of our wonderful presenters, and especially Katya for bringing us all together and working behind the scenes. I think it was very insightful and very informative, and we are recording this, so it will be available for others who are not able to. There was a huge interest, and I'm sure, you know, when time comes, there are all sorts of time conflicts, but I'm sure there'll be people will be able to access it and watch it later and learn about the wonderful British Library. So I thank you everyone for your time, and hopefully we'll see each other around. And have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Olga. Bye, everyone.